Ooh, that's off to a good start. All right. Hello, and welcome to this live with two of my, I'm just going to say OKR besties, Maria Rowcliffe and Natalie Webb. And we are here to share our insights with you about what we see in the forecast for OKRs in 2025. And it's going to be more than that. All three of us are strategists, not just OKR professionals. We each have our little different kind of angle and lens and focus. So before we dive in, I'm Sara Lobkovich. I'm your host today. I'm the host of the Thinky Doers podcast and the creator of No-BS OKRs. I am super excited that these two said yes to this. So I'm going to let Natalie introduce herself, and then Maria, and then we'll dive right in with our conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us. It's quite the dream team, by the way. I've heard several people say that. We got it. All good.
The dream.
So hello.
If only the host can work with technology.
We need handlers for that, I think. I love just being able to come in and do the voodoo. I like the idea of handlers.
Ellie gave me a thing that I can push the buttons to make it all work right, and I don't know how to use it. So maybe after this, I'll set that.
Amazing. Okay, so who am I? Natalie Webb. Thanks for being here. I've told a few people about this podcast live stream, and they've referred to us three as the dream team. So I'm super excited to be here with you gals. Been in the OKR space now for almost 8 years, I guess. So it works. I think that's why I stick with it, because it's great to see results with clients. So that's me.
Awesome. And then I don't know if you can tell us where you're located right now.
I am currently in Saudi Arabia. I'm working with Aramco and the very smart people there in the digital transformation and Aramco AI groups. So very timely to have this conversation about generative AI and where it might be going and things I'm seeing.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the first question I get asked everywhere I go. So we're going to start right there.
Awesome.
Well, welcome. And Maria, welcome.
Thank you so much. I love the No-BS OKRs because that you speak in my language. But thank you so much for having me. So a little bit about me. So I have been seriously passionate about understanding how organizations and people in them, actually more probably so, become successful. And back in the day when I was getting my MBA, we had to choose what to study for a whole semester. And the two options were finance and capital markets and organizational behavior and management. And out of my whole year, there were 16 of us that chose to study management and organizational behavior. And I was obviously one of them. And that was very much around how do organizations make decisions and how do they execute them. And ever since then, this is kind of what I've been passionate about. And just like Natalie, I've used a lot of different frameworks in the past. And OKRs, I would say, has the potential of having the most kind of transformative changes. But there's a lot of ways in making it go wrong and also a lot of ways of making it go right, which is what we're going to talk about today. But that's what I've been spending, over 30 years at this point. And I think between the three of us, we have just a ridiculous amount of experience of this. So hopefully there's going to be some useful stuff we say. So that's a little bit about me. The last thing I just want to kind of say, because I always get this question, where are you from? Because my accent, I'm Swedish, but I've lived in the US now for 35 years. And the fun fact is my dad's name is Leif Erikson, and so it doesn't really get more Swedish than that. And it was his birthday yesterday.
Oh my goodness. Well, happy birthday, Pops.
Yep, 86.
Wow, good genes. Yeah, I always love the conversations we have, because if I put you two in buckets, because I put everything in buckets.
And that's where we love to be, in buckets, don't we?
Maria is like I don't love the word guru. I'm trying to think of something else, but you're like the chief of staff person. I mean, there's so much more to you, but like, you're one of the folks that I look up to for chief of staff support and chief of staffing and the life of chiefs of staff and the role of a chief of staff as a leader, not just a leader strategist, not just the ops and admin side. So Maria's a champ there. And then Natalie is like a super smart sciencey patentee. There's so much more to you. And so beyond just being incredible OKR experts, I am just really excited to introduce more folks to both of you, because you've got such incredible experience in OKRs. And then, like a lot of us in this field, OKRs aren't the only thing we do. Like, we're drawn to OKRs so that we can be more effective in what we do elsewhere. So all right, well, we'll get into our discussion, and the place that we're going to start is where it's the first question I get everywhere I go right now is, let's start with Natalie, since you're kind of in this space. How do you see generative AI and potentially other emerging technologies, but right now generative AI is what is on everyone's minds. How do you see generative AI affecting or reshaping goal setting practices?
Yeah, and common question I get all the time. And I'll tell you, my answer to this question has changed just this year, honestly. And that's really because of the technology that's come out around quantum computing. The ability to do quantum computing now, Google came out with the technology to do that. Being able to look back at all of this data and to decipher what all that data means for predictive analytics, for machine learning, for creating models that work and ones that don't quickly is just crazy. So this idea, of course, I'm working with the very talented folks at Aramco, but Forbes is calling this ability to search through history of data the new black gold, which is an interesting play on words, given where I am in the world. But data as a service and providing quick business decisions based on decades and decades of data to the element level. I'm a nerd about data visualization and just even about the quantum computing piece of it. But the ability to learn quickly from all of that history and turn that into predictive analytics for generative AI is just like mind blowing. So, long ago are the days of, ones and zeros and doing it in the old way. Being able to do it simultaneously in quantum computing is just amazing, an amazing place to be. So I'm super excited about it because of that aspect. I will say I've seen some trepidation with healthcare related clients. They're afraid. Yeah, I think you guys have too. But in the technology sector, preparing for digital disruption for them is an opportunity and not a fear. So that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, that's awesome perspective. And Maria, what are you seeing in your practice?
Well, so I'm a little bit of Tigger and a little bit of Eeyore, right? So the Tigger in me kind of agrees with what you said, Natalie. I think that there's a huge opportunity around data analytics, data insights, tracking proactively, managing progress. So that's the Tigger part. And then the Eeyore part is, this is a tool. right? This is a tool and an enabler. It's not a driver. And so kind of the fact that all of this needs to land on humans, collaborating well, making great decisions and execution, that hasn't changed. And I think very little of the human condition, right, and the way we show up and we interact with others has kind of changed. And that's still going to be there. And so I think, I know that we're going to talk more about kind of the hype around this, but I don't think that this changes the heavy lifting in terms of how people work together or not. And I think that's the risk when you get too excited about a technology, which I'm sure all of us have experienced, right? Both ourselves and, with clients, and, me as having been a chief of staff and head of business operations in lots of companies. I've certainly been part of that on both ends. But I always end with, that goes back to what I have been excited about all along, which is how do people actually make decisions? And so it's a huge enabler and a tool, but it really isn't the driver, I would say.
I love that spending time with you two makes me smarter because it's even like when I wrote that question, I was thinking about what I've seen, which is I've seen a lot of attention on generative AI for creating OKRs, for like filling that gap of easing the difficulty of creation. And so, I'm not even thinking about the predictive analytics part or the lack of impact that generative AI might have on the actual how we work together. That always just comes down to humans. And I wrote a blog post a couple months ago that is now really outdated. Like Natalie, like I've had a shift just in the last couple months where wrote a blog post a couple months ago saying, it's just not ready for prime time. Like generative AI can't create OKRs as well as humans. And then I have to say, like with the models having been trained more, and getting smarter and then prompting getting better, I actually wish I had recorded. I've been kind of playing with tools and trialing tools, and I wish I had recorded my first login to a tool called Tability, which folks who listen to the podcast know Tability because I've interviewed them. I'm a fan of them as human beings. But I logged into the tool and I saw their AI, facilitated OKR creation. And I was like, oh, let's see how bad this is. And I gave it a prompt and I was like, ooh, wow, that's actually quite good. And so, I think the outcomes from generative AI are only as good as the prompts and the training, and so I don't think it's, I think in the right hands, they're an enabler. For me, they can speed things up. And as far as the impact of the actual work with people, like for me, they help me take my verbal processing and turn it into something that humans can digest and understand. So for me to be more clear, concise, or more easily simplifying concepts, things like that, I find them really valuable. I just still really struggle with trust with the platforms, even though I'm still a lawyer, so I've read every word of every agreement. And I still had a conversation yesterday with some of the folks in my class about, like, they asked if I'm using generative AI and they asked if I'm training a model on my work. Yeah. And I was like, I mean, for me, certain things, but there've been some hard lines. And then while we were talking about it, I was like, well, if I don't train a model on my work, someone else is gonna. So it's just like the ethics and the environmental impact. There's so much to it, but I also went from being a kind of holdout, not going to use it, to now I really do see the utility in some parts of, especially OKR creation, with a well-trained model and a well set up prompt.
So can I ask a question for either of you, which is, have you guys used it with your clients? How did that show up? Like, how are you generated AI? Because I certainly have not to date. I have used it, and I don't know the number of times I have written back is that is not a KR, right? Because it gives you back milestones and tasks and what have you, right? And so I started training my own also because it's like, no, that's not an objective, that's a project. And so it still gives back a lot of that. But would love to hear kind of how you guys, if at all, have actually used it in sessions or with clients or organizations you work with, because I haven't.
I'm using it every day.
Oh.
Clients now, and that's changed just since really like December. But even as far back as October, and many of my clients have their own version. If they have a large technical presence, they have their own version of AI. But I'm finding even myself, I'm using Claude and ChatGPT more than I use Google.
Oh yeah.
Day now. And I see it in my sessions where, and it's usually to your point where they get to like, hey, I want it to be this, but instead of going to a thesaurus, right, they go to ChatGPT or some sort of AI tool, and they look for words, and it does help with their creativity. But to your point, Maria, it still has to be vetted that it's going to drive the result, right?
Yeah.
You still have to have somebody say, okay, it may be written accurately, but is this really what you want to focus your people time and dollars on?
Yeah.
And then that goes into the conversation of, is this really our critical strategy path? So yeah, I think it can be helpful. It can also be distracting. Because then they get like 5 different examples, and then they are more confused on which one they like. Yeah.
I mean, I've had clients always want examples. Well, can you just show me a marketing client wants, can you just show me an example of marketing OKRs? And I'm like, no, because yours, I don't want you to look at those. And then, it's too easy to look at the example and say, okay, well, that looks good. And then adopt it, as opposed to doing the work of actually thinking about what is most important for your business and your timing. And now, so the thing that I have found, so the way that I'm using generative AI in my practice is I'm finding it's helping me speed up my OKR workshops, because especially things like objective forming, where like my approach to objective forming is lightning fast. We don't spend a lot of time deliberating. We do a quick ideation. What's important? Why does it matter? We put them together. That's your objective. But even with that, what I'm finding is, I can get clients to where they have concepts, and then where they have concepts of a plan for their objective, so I can get them to concepts, and then instead of having to take the time to actually get it to a single statement in the room, I can say, if it's okay with you, I'm going to take these concepts, feed them into a model, and give you some options. And so my workshop efficiency on objective creation has gone way up, because then once, it spits out a couple options, clients can kind of make a decision of what they want to keep, but it takes that objective deliberation out of the workshop and lets us do it in the final finishing. And then what I always hope, and this is why I'm training my own model, is I hope that we can use these tools to help enable people's critical thinking about creatively creating key results. So like thinking beyond the obvious KPIs they have available, or thinking beyond what they see in the examples. Some of the approaches to key results I work with are pretty out there. And so I'd love to have the model be able to help enable people's creative thinking about what key results could be, beyond kind of the examples that most people usually see. But I have the same thing, like every time I sit down with one, and I'm like, because sometimes when I'm preparing a training, I'm like, I just need an example set of OKRs. Yeah. And so I'll type in, can you give me an example set of OKRs for a software engineering team, or for a marketing analytics team? And it spits it out, and I'm like, no, now I have to train the model. Like now I have to teach you what an OKR is.
Yeah.
So Yeah, I think in, I think in expert hands, the tools are an incredible enabler, efficiency source. I just worry about, we already struggle enough with methodology understanding and quality of methodology adoption. And so I do worry about people putting too much faith in the training of the models if they don't have the expertise.
So one thing that I have done, and I've used it more as an examples, which is to help identify kind of leading indicators, right? Because I think we all know what the general kind of KPIs are and the lagging indicators, because those are the metrics that we kind of all know and maybe not love so much. But it's like the leading indicators that you actually can actively manage throughout the quarter that I think not just us, but I mean, my experience, both in my own thinking as well as working with clients, that's still kind of the harder thing to do, because that requires more thinking, right, than what we typically want to spend on stuff like that. So that's why we get milestones and kind of those, KPIs that you can measure twice in a quarter, right, as KRs. But I mean, also I use ChatGPT primarily, and I have got it to actually give me pretty good kind of leading indicators that may not be what organizations actually should be managing, to your point, Natalie. Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's actually the right for you. But I think you're just seeing examples of what those leading indicators could be that is a bit kind of out there, like you said, Sarah, right? Can actually help people kind of think about it, what it is that they really should be managing kind of day over day.
I am so glad you brought that up, because I would agree. The hardest part of OKR creation and methodology adoption in my practice is leading indicator identification. That's where I see people struggle the most. So that's I don't think I've used it for that, but that's a really awesome insight that continues to be one of the big barriers, even for those of us who do this every day and have really finely honed approaches to use with clients. Clients still struggle with the leading indicator piece, partly because it also means they instead of having the whole quarter to make progress on their outcome, it's moving up their accountability to a nearer time horizon. So it increases the anxiety. But that's brilliant, Maria. I think using those tools as a way to get ideas for leading indicators is a really good specific use case.
Mm-hmm. It is. I agree too. And one other thing I've seen recently is a shift in sort of accepting functional team level sets of OKRs versus, like everybody gets a KR, like the Oprah, not everybody should have a KR. Not everybody gets a KR. This is not like a participation trophy thing. And I think making sure everybody understands how they contribute to this strategy, but they don't have to have their name on it. It can be at the functional team level, and they should still know how they're contributing to overall company strategy. That's another shift that I've seen, is stripping out layers where we can. So instead of like everybody having, specific objectives and key results that are cascaded, how we used to see them blown out, 7 layers or levels. I'm seeing functional teams hovering with like sub KRs under the top level KR, because they're spiky and fast and smart and moving quickly and startups, and they don't have time for the layers. So that's one thing I'm noticing too is, because back in the day, we used to give everybody their own individual KRs too, and they were like duplicated everywhere with just names on them, and it was too heavy. And so I like that we're stripping out some of those layers to make it spiky and fast. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Natalie. And Maria, I'm curious, because we all work with kind of different types of organizations, different sizes. I'm also seeing what Natalie is, that the localization or cascading or connecting OKRs looks really different now than when I started working with OKRs. But Maria, what are you seeing in your practice?
I think it's the same. This is has always been kind of the biggest problem, right? It's the easiest thing is for the leadership team to set OKRs, even though some of them still struggle with that, because it's like they have, the top level metrics to choose between, and that as you go down, it's harder and harder. And the whole, I know that we have all created these descriptions of what localization looks like, and it is so damn hard to kind of describe it without getting all complicated about it. And so, not surprising, that's also what organizations struggle with. So finding that middle ground, how to do it, because OKRs is still not about the leadership team setting it. It is about how people spend their time actually doing and driving towards. And that happens further down in the organization. So coming up with good ways for making that live, not to the leadership team, but kind of not even a level down, right? But the third level, typically in larger organizations, is where most of that goodness happens or not. And creating them to be aligned with each other, because that's also, if everybody just had their KRs or their OKRs and they're all still kind of wildly kind of not in alignment, it's not going to do an awful lot of good for the organization anyway, or solving the problem, which is what the reason why people try to implement OKRs in the first place. And so it's I think it's still a struggle for organizations to figure out how to do that at a lower level, and especially kind of creating alignment. And I don't know about you guys, but I work a lot with organizations that have implemented OKRs already and are not seeing the value that they were hoping for. And inevitably, there's a couple of things I see. One is you ask them, why did you implement OKRs? And they don't necessarily have a good answer to that, other than we want to be more clear, aligned. Like they've read a book essentially, right? But they don't have a why that is a problem to solve, that is relevant and kind of resonates with the people in the organization. And they don't necessarily have an intentional kind of structure around the goal setting process and the alignment, how they actually going to help their teams get aligned and clear. But it's more about, the leadership team have set OKRs. And so that means that 3 levels down, everyone's clear, which we know isn't true.
Yeah, we've got a great question in the chat, in the comments, that we'll come back to in just a sec. So folks who are tuned in, if you have questions at any time, send them through. I can see them in 2 different places, and we'll answer as many as possible while we're live. No, I'm seeing the same thing. It always surprises me how hard clients struggle. I do a lot. I would say at this point, I'm probably doing about maybe 30% fresh from scratch implementations and about 70% reboots, or we're struggling and we need help kind of engagements. And a lot of the demand I see is for help with localization to the individual.
Yeah.
It's like they've gotten started, or they're adopting OKRs because they want to localize to the individual, or because they've read the book that shows the 6 layers, and it is the first conversation I have to have is that's just not how I do it. Partly because of the amount of time it takes, partly because of the degradation of methodology quality if we go too many layers. And then partly, I was working with a very, very large, very deep organization, and had the privilege of working with them quarter over quarter for a couple of years. And so what I saw was, as the leadership, and so they were doing a cross-functional L1 at the company level, and then a functional L2 localization at the org level. And as they did that, if we had high quality OKRs at the company level and at the functional level, we didn't need to localize anymore downward. Like Natalie said, there were some KRs that would roll down from there, but we didn't see any gain from doing full localization at like L3, L4. What we started to see instead was that teams could bottoms up from there. So instead of the systemic, everybody has to go down, we'd have that downward flow from L1, L2, and then at L3, L4 for initiative teams, for individuals, they could look up at L1 and L2 and get the direction that they needed, either to create work plans and then, do their delivery, or to create objectives and key results, or objectives, key results, and milestones and work plans. But it just that the downward, I still see some orgs do the downward localization and cascading, and I see it in control-based leadership cultures, where it degrades down to activity micromanagement really quickly. And I also see it in organizations where the L1 leaders aren't actually creating OKRs, where they're doing something else, or they're creating something and calling it OKRs, but it doesn't actually fit the definition of OKRs. And so then L2 does their best to compensate. And then L3, Maria, you said the magic happens at L3. That's where the magic happens at L3. Because then L3 is like, well, that's a bunch of hooey. So what are we actually going to do? And then they get it, So I try not to work. I screen out every once in a while. I wind up working with one of those, like the magics at L3 orgs. I struggle in that environment because my approach and my way just isn't compatible with those kind of leaders who are like, OKRs for everyone else, not for me. That just doesn't, it's not a culture fit to work with me in that style, but I see it. But more and more it's just L1, L2, and then everyone else is bottom up.
So I think that that's fine, but as long as there is actually some kind of structured and formalized process that says, okay, these are the initiatives that we are working on, and the tasks that this is how we're spending our time and are planning on spending our time. Can we articulate, how it actually is contributing to, the goals that we have set, or that the organization have set? But it's always scary, right, when people are working on initiatives and they actually do not have a clue or are not very clear on, they would say it's important, but they can't like clearly articulate how it is supporting the strategic priorities of the organization. And I mean, then the sad part of it also is, right, oftentimes they then work on things that don't move the needle on anything that matters. And so when they're done, they're like, instead of ta-da, it's like, poof. I mean, they're done and they worked really hard. And so it doesn't create purposeful work. And so I still think, even if the full-on, localization process that we have all done in our careers, right, all the way down, like, isn't necessarily the most effective way of doing it. I still think that having a structure and a process where all teams, where most teams can articulate how the work that they are doing contributes to strategic priorities and the metrics, and know if they're doing that or not, is still really important for any kind of goal setting process to result in something that matters. And maybe I'm coming at this, like you said it at the top. I mean, I've spent most of my time with OKRs and strategy planning has been as the driver of it internally in an organization. So I kind of think about, if I'm responsible for getting the outcomes at the end of the day, I think about this differently than if I am a coach or a consultant, where, I don't have the same skin in the game, as it were, in terms of thinking about all the aspects of execution, including management practices and readiness and capabilities and integration with other stuff, which, if you're overseeing all of that, you just think bigger, and I think you think differently about things than if you're coming in a more narrow lane, right, to set just the goals and maybe trickle it down a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the distinction I would make is, just it's not that we don't have that clarity at, deeper in the organization. For me, I wish I could draw a picture, because for me, it's just about the directionality. In the conventional or older style, we would localize downward the whole way down. And I know you guys remember, like, I had one client where we localized for an entire quarter. Like, it took an entire quarter to get through the localization, And so what we're doing different now is, instead of doing that sequential quarter, team by team down the org, we're doing L1, we're doing L2, and then we're doing a localization cycle where everyone else does their bottoms up. So important initiatives create OKRs or work plans or whatever if it just has to get done, it's delivery planning. If it has to yield an outcome, they create OKRs. But it just, the shift isn't that we're not using OKRs elsewhere in the organization. The shift is just on the timing, and that it's like in my drawing that everything below L2 or L3, sometimes we go to L3, but everything below that is in a big cloud, because it all happens at the same time, and then we can do a quick alignment instead of taking all quarter to do the sequential localizing.
One thing I used to say that I still say to this day is, if we're setting our OKRs up well, teams should be empowered to say no to other things that get thrown at them.
Yeah.
And I still firmly believe in that, because it is disheartening, I think, to folks, especially that horsepower, the L3s and 4s and 5 levels that are just really crushing the work. If they have two lists, if they have like the work that leads up to OKRs and then all the other stuff, and they're just over capacity, stretched too thin, and that's just not visible. So I call those misses, really, because we have to make sure that they're not spread too thin. And I love working at the detailed level with folks. I love traversing, L1s all the way to L7s and back again, and catch those misses. I think that's good stuff. I like doing that.
It is. So we've got a couple good questions I want to ask, and then Stacy asks, some execs expect to see that even individuals have KRs, or that everybody's work ties to a KR. So this kind of gets at what we've all been talking about. But sometimes that's not realistic. So in the situations in your practice where you try and steer away from that everybody has a KR, do you have any tactics you use, or how do you handle that when a client is focused on that everybody has a KR?
I mean, I can share. It's interesting because everyone in the company contributes to the strategy, honestly, even if it's facilities, keeping the facility safe and secure for people to come and do work, they're contributing to the strategy. So even though their name may not be tied to a KR, it is tied to a body of work that is showing, that the operation is happening, that the lights are on, doors are open, business is happening. And so I like to involve everybody that we can in those conversations, especially when they're contributing to the top level, so they don't feel left out. But also the follow-up question I get to this is, do you tie compensation and performance management to individuals with KRs? Because then it feels weird, and it feels like Big Brother, and it feels like you're going to see some sandbagging if people have any compensation tied to their key results and they're at the individual level. So it does get weird. I like to hear the functional teams and carve out that, critical bodies of work is the words I've been using with them, to make sure they know how they contribute. But it's not a participation trophy kind of thing. Not everybody is going to have their name on a KR.
Yeah. So the logic that I try to use, sometimes more successfully than others, is the whole concept of focus and prioritization. Right. So one of the best leaders I've ever had the pleasure to working with, he used to say, it isn't prioritization unless it hurts. And the fact of the matter is, if everybody has a KR, that is never anyone's definition of focus. Because then the organization ends up with how many KRs that they are
Yeah.
supposed to
Yeah.
be driving towards, right? And so it's more around being able to articulate how the way I'm spending my time and the decisions that I make are contributing to those. So I'm perfectly fine with saying, which of these KRs do you contribute to? It doesn't mean that you own them, right? That you are the only one who's owning that, because that's the other concept. Like, very few things important in an organization is done by one person. Because if it is, it's probably not all that strategic. And so it's all about, the people working together to make it happen. And so I'm perfectly fine with having lists that says this KR, who are the people that are the most important contributors to that based on the daily work that they do, or even the teams.
Yeah, it's so, and this kind of dovetails into another question we got from Elena of understanding that OKRs are not a project management tool. How do you integrate them without losing the scope that each should have? And so my answer to both questions is connected, is that we draw one of the first education steps I do with clients is that there is a difference between what just has to get done, like getting it done is success. And if getting it done is success, that in my model falls under delivery, that gets project managed, it gets planned. There might be some, KRs identified for change initiatives if we're improving something. But there's a lot that just has to get done in our organizations. And the old language of OKRs, that we need an OKR for what's most important in the business, doesn't apply, because paying the electric bill and getting payroll out on time and those fundamentals that just have to get done are as important as any innovation initiative we have. So that's one of our very first education points is, if it just has to get done, it doesn't need an OKR. And if you don't have OKRs, so we create OKRs for delivery, for if it just has to get done. And then if just getting it done isn't success, that's where OKRs come in, where we need to aim for an outcome or some kind of impact or success criteria. And even with that, breakdown, it's still hard for clients to wrap their heads around. But I find when I start with a new org with that model that hasn't implemented OKRs, and we can get ahead of the what's important goes in the OKRs, so everyone feels like they have to be visible in the OKRs, it's working pretty well. Because then the people get recognized through delivery and project management for the stuff that just has to get done. And we have smaller sets of OKRs because we can really zero in on, well, does this just have to get done? If so, give it a milestone. If we have to achieve some sort of success criteria, then what is it? So that's, Elena, that's for me kind of the split, is that we can project manage what we do and what we plan and what has to get done. And then we can use our stretch thinking and our more expansive thinking around what's possible on the OKR side.
I have an example on project. Do you have another question?
No, I was just going to say, let's come back to individual goals, though. Let's finish this conversation, and then we're going to come back to that.
We can all say, don't do it. Right?
The performance management link.
Yeah.
I have seen some things, though. So I want to hear, I think it'll be a fascinating conversation to talk about what we've seen, but we could finish this one out. So Natalie, you said you had a project management example.
Oh yeah. So I think it's important, if you have a lot of milestones that you're trying to get accomplished through a project plan, whatever project tool you have, the way I like to show that is, say the KR is deliver all 100 milestones for Project Rocket Ship by the end of Q1, instead of listing out the milestones. Yeah, the body of work. Yeah. So then they can manage the milestones, and it's a big number that they're tracking, and it's also leading. So that's one way, but then the milestones are tracked in another tool, or a robust OKR tool that does tasks, actions, and milestones beneath the KR. Yeah.
So that's really cool, because then it also gives the visibility to the
exactly
work.
right.
Maria.
Yeah, so the approach is, I think that, the fact that we call it OKR, I think is part of the problem, because it's actually not just OKRs, it's also kind of the work that comes after that. So if it's OKRA kind of actions or I initiatives, and so I think that that's, if you stop the planning on, we have the KRs, without then saying, okay, what work is actually going to drive us there, I think that's one kind of reason why these problems occur, because you have project planning over here and you have OKR planning over here, and they're not clearly connected. So I think that connecting the two, I think, is important. And quite honestly, if you say, what would if you identify the KRs that are milestones or activities, and you kind of go, okay, so you have, out of, let's say, 15 KRs, 12 of them are actually activities and milestones and actions. So then that's not strategic outcomes that they're looking to drive. And then say, are any of these things in a platform or on a plan somewhere else? Then why are you doing KRs? Then you're duplicating work. And the fact is that I would say that that is one of the main reasons why teams, especially further down in the org, kind of don't like OKRs, because they feel like, why are we doing this? We're duplicating things that we already do in some other platform. And they're right. I think it's part of the educational thing that we can help do, to kind of help highlight initially what their current KRs are and how much they are projects and that actually managed somewhere else. And so I have templates, right, when identifying KRs, that also includes a box for what's the work that's going to drive it. And that could be existing initiatives and projects or new things that we need to do, so that you kind of help people kind of see turtles all the way down, as they say.
I love that. Turtles all the way down is awesome. Okay, fantastic. So now I have a million questions, and we have 11 minutes, if I'm doing my math right. So we're going to have to do this like quarterly or every half year or something.
Yes. Dream team.
Yeah. So the two things that I want to make sure we get to first is the other question I get every time a client calls, which is, how do we connect OKRs to performance management? And so what would you two say when you get that question? How do you respond?
Well, I can say it always makes me a little nervous to understand their why about that. Is it because you want to really drive, operational efficiencies or process reengineering? Like what is it that you want to drive? If it's that they think people are not working hard enough, I struggle with that. And so it's tough for me because you run into all kinds of nuances around how do you measure one person compared to another, and then do you compensate on that, and then it gets really weird with money. And so I say at the functional team level, you're absolutely going to look at how that team has performed against their key results, and did they meet their goals, were there wins, were there do differently's, and would you factor that in a performance evaluation? Absolutely. But would you also factor like 15 other things? Yes. Are they a good leader? Do they learn well? Do they apply themselves? How are they showing up each day? And so there's lots of other factors. I would say the bodies of work that they complete are one of the elements in performance evaluation, but OKRs are not it for performance.
So the other kind of point that I make is, with OKRs, I at least try to say you shouldn't just focus on setting OKRs around things you have control over, right? Because again, no team or individual has control over an awful lot of stuff that's strategic, right? Because you should be able to influence it, highly influence it. And if you can't influence it, then having a KR around it isn't particularly useful. I think performance management or goal setting is the complete opposite. You have to set, goals for people that they actually have control over, or more influence than things you set around KRs. And so if you try to marry the two, you end up either with KRs that aren't necessarily strategic or broad enough, right? Because you're going to say one person can do it, or you're going to end up with KRs that no person actually can, influence, and it's unfair to have them be accountable for that. And then you're going to have other problems to solve, right, with people being held accountable for things that just aren't possible. And so I think it comes down to conversations between a manager and their direct report to say, okay, this is what we need to accomplish this quarter, or this half year, or whatever cycle they use for doing this, and say, what is it reasonable that you will do or contribute or accomplish in this period of time? And to your point, Natalie, both in terms of the outcome that they do, but also how they do their work, right? Which is, a key thing with performance management, including what are the new skills and the new things you want to get better at, which also is completely unrelated to some extent, right, to KRs, because it's part of how you do your work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's I wrote an enormous chapter for the book on why I'm in the we don't connect OKRs directly. Attainment of OKRs. We don't connect attainment of OKRs to performance management or incentive pay because, and we had to pull it out, and I'm sharing it as a blog post because it was like, it was the longest book chapter in the history of OKRs.
Yeah.
But I think you two covered it really well. There is a perspective, even among OKR experts. There is a group. There's a position paper out there. If I can find it afterward, I'll add it to the comments, by one of the trade orgs where, when everybody started working together on it, the assumption was that the industry would say, we don't connect OKRs to performance. And in the creation of that position paper, at least the last time I saw it, there were two camps. There is a camp that says, here's how you do it. And then there's the rest of us who's like, for me, when clients say they want to do that, I say, okay, let me tell you a couple stories about what I've seen. Is this what you want your system to look like? Where people who are ambitious and set stretch goals get penalized in terms of incentive pay compared to people who set conservative goals and fully achieve them. So there are a couple scenarios where I can say, here's what happens when you connect attainment to incentives. This is what happens. This isn't, a fable. It's what happens if you look at the system design of it. Here's the system you're setting up. Is that what you want? But we have, we've developed a scheme that factors OKR contribution into performance evaluation, but not attainment. So we never ever link it to attainment.
I think the problem, right, is that, when we say it shouldn't be connected, people think that the work that people do shouldn't be actually connected to KRs, which is obviously not what we're saying. It's just that it shouldn't be a one-to-one, right? That you own the KR, and if that's not achieved, that means that your performance weren't good or wasn't good.
Right.
My English,
right.
Sorry.
No, all good. So let's do a speed round because we're almost out of time, and we've got one other great question. So what is the very first step? And unfortunately, it just shows me LinkedIn user for this one, so I can't say who's asking the question. But what is the very first step for an organization to implement OKRs?
Ooh, I would say have a strategic roadmap in mind, at least an idea of the critical bodies of work. Speed round, yeah.
Yeah, so mine is know your why. What problems are OKR supposed to solve? Because if you are not clear on the why and the why now in a way that resonates with people, they're not going to be successful. And not because people are bad, but people are busy. And it requires a new way of thinking. And in order for people to take the time and energy to do that, there has to be a compelling reason and benefit to them to do it, just for themselves as well as the organization.
You guys made it hard for me to think of one because you gave the two best answers. But so I'll give a spiky or a spicy answer. The very first step I would say is to look beyond the paid search results from OKR software platforms
Oh, nice.
to learn about what's happening in OKRs today, because organizations would do themselves well to start with a strong methodology focus and then figure out what tool they need. And, it's like we can create tool successfulness if we get methodology established well and get participation high with methodology. But so much of everything is dominated by information from platforms. That it's really hard, so I would recommend that folks find me or you two or Ben, Lamore, they're like methodology experts who every time we talk to each other, I'm surprised at how much we agree on, and how much we agree on is different from what was in some of the original books or some of what we hear from platforms. So that would be my first step. All right. So then there's a couple really good other angles to that question, but we've got a hard stop. So LinkedIn user, the rest of your questions, I'll make sure we get an answer to you either in the comments or in follow-up. You two, I want to thank you so much. This exceeded my hopes and dreams by so much. I knew we were going to have fun, but this was just fantastic. So Natalie, where can people find you if they want more information?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. Of course, I work with all the pool of OKR experts is fairly small who have been in this over 8 years. Of course, I work with Ben OKRs. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me, I think, Natalie Webb, and maybe put in Colorado or Wyoming, because I think there's a few. But yeah, I mean, we could send our information probably through you, right, Sarah? Okay, awesome.
Yeah. So we'll make sure we'll post the contact info in the comments, but just in case anyone ever sees this disconnected from the comments. Amazing. So Natalie Webb, find Natalie on LinkedIn, and then Maria, where can folks find you?
Same thing with me. LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to find me as well, as long as you spell my last name correctly, which most people have a challenge to do.
Yeah, I'm in that boat too. Awesome. And then I'm Sara Lobkovich. You can find me at findrc.co or at my book website of You Are a Strategist. Yeah, coming soon. YouAreAstrategist.com. So you two, thank you so much. I'm going to end the stream. For everyone who joined, thank you so much. This was awesome questions. The replay will be available in the next couple days. So thank you too.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Yay. Let's do it again.
I know that.